Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to the MindTrace Podcast, episode number 5. I'm your host, Ajmal Savari, and today we'll look into the science of decision making with our guest, Alan. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MindTrace Podcast. In this podcast, we're bridging the gap between science and its application in UX. We're having conversations with guests from these two worlds, all with the aim of figuring out the UX of certain industries, how UX can use scientific discoveries, what UX industries can learn from each other, and what questions UX has for science. Our guest today is Dr. Alan Sanfey. Alan is a principal investigator at the Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition and Behavior. Previously, he has held positions as Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Arizona and as a postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University. He currently heads the Decision Neuroscience group at the Donders Institute, and his research uses a novel approach to the study of both individual and interactive decision-making by combining the methods of behavioral experiments, functional neuroimaging, and formal economic models. A further goal of his group is to use the knowledge gleaned from these studies to inform public policy debates. In this conversation, we talk about the science of decision-making and how it could be used in industry. We discuss various aspects of decision-making theory and how industry has tried to incorporate them and where things sometimes go wrong. You can find Alan on his personal website at www.alansanfey.com. Enough background. Let's get into it, shall we? Alan, thanks so much for taking the time. It's actually a beautiful day outside. And for the past few days, it's been raining quite a lot. So it's, again, sad that we sit inside, but I hope the listeners can appreciate the audio quality at least.
Yes, I can imagine the sun shining down.
Yeah.
In Nijmegen.
Well, they can sit outside listening to us.
Yes, indeed.
I hope that will be a good day too. Well, actually, I'm certain it will be. Now, we have actually met each other. I don't actually think you remember. We met, and I don't blame you for not remembering. There were plenty of students in that class. But it was 2010. And you gave a guest lecture in, I think what the course was, social neurocognition.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Still giving that guest lecture.
You're still giving that?
The guest lecture has changed.
Oh, right.
The students change and the lecture changes.
Okay.
But that's still in my schedule every year.
Yeah, but I remember that we were just 4 students or 5 from this certain theme of the studies. And it was taught by Ivan Tony. And you gave a guest lecture on decision making. Mm-hmm. And everyone was super fascinated. And I still remember it so well because you explained findings from the trust game, which we'll talk about in a little bit, hopefully. So listeners, you then understand what we're talking about. But in essence, you have to play with a game partner. And you proposed this scenario. You put a picture up on the screen and you asked, how much would you give or invest in this person? And it was like a number between 0 and 10. And everybody said something like 7 or 9. And I was the only one that said 0. And you were very upset about that because it was a friend of yours that was on the screen, which of course I didn't know. But well, that definitely made it very memorable to me.
Well, perhaps it said more about your trust than my friend's face.
It definitely does.
But there's always one or two who are conservative in their investments.
That's true. Games. Yeah. Well, I think conservative is still very nicely put. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think ever anyone invested 0 on the first go.
Well, in these games, typically that does happen. And, probably 10% of people would like to keep what they have and not engage in risky behavior with trusting other people, which can go badly wrong, of course.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can see it in the industry all the time. Mm-hmm. When it comes to collaboration and there's no trust, it just goes very, very wrong.
Yes.
And even if the economic incentives are aligned.
Yeah, and that's interesting how trust can be then separated from risk. So people, obviously, when you're trusting someone, there's some element of risk assessment, but there's, I think, an extra component of this feeling of, is this person or entity or organization trustworthy?
Yeah.
And one interesting thing, I think, is how quickly that can go. So if trust falls apart, it takes a long time to repair that again. And so I think it's an interesting phenomenon to study in the context of decision making.
Right. Now, that was 9 years ago. Now, 9 years ago, you came to the Donders Institute, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And basically, you're a professor in decision making of neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my question to you is so that the listeners can understand a bit more, because they already heard the bio in the intro, but what made decision making so interesting to you?
Well, for me, it's always been the most fascinating aspect of psychology. I think it's in some way the essence of what makes us human, that we have to make decisions. We have to decide our courses of action, and these can be very trivial decisions as to what we have for lunch, or more important decisions like, do we engage in a podcast?
Right.
Or really serious decisions, do we buy a house? Do we get married? What job do we take? And of all the different facets of psychology, this was the one that kind of resonated with me immediately once I started studying psychology way back as an undergraduate, because this seemed to encompass all of those other aspects, memory, cognition, language, perception. All of those seem to really boil down to and be distilled to how we make decisions and choices. And one thing that always struck me was that we didn't really know that much about it. So there was a lot of research in different fields. So, for example, economics, some in neuroscience, but the psychology of decision making was rather limited, and limited to a particular type of studies, which were these studies by Kahneman and Tversky. People probably know Danny Kahneman as a Nobel Prize winner and an author of Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of the most, I think, successful popular science books. And Danny Kahneman with Amos Tversky led a very influential research program which tried to understand decision making, but which tried to understand it from the perspective of when it goes wrong. And so they had wonderful, vivid examples of people making kind of, quote, irrational decisions, which are tremendously entertaining. And it's really nice to see these examples, which are a little bit equivalent to looking at perceptual illusions when you're trying to study vision. So you look at where the system kind of breaks down.
It tells you something about the system, right?
It does indeed, and of course it's very informative. But I always felt it was a little bit limited in that there's a wide variety of cases where there either isn't a rational or irrational response. There isn't an optimal solution, and that most of the time we actually do pretty well with our decisions. Right? We successfully navigate the world to the most part. We've all arrived here thanks to careful decision making by our generations of ancestors. So we must be doing something right. So I became interested in studying decision making, but not just from the kind of where it fails part. And so could we kind of better understand how we make decisions without necessarily the judgment of whether they're good or bad, but just understand the process by which we arrive at choices in everyday life.
And that has then led you from the more studies that were more focused on figuring out when does it break down, more into the neuroscience aspects of it?
Yeah, that was the trajectory. So initially my PhD was in cognitive psychology, and there we were inspired by many of these Kahneman and Tversky studies to look at how memory plays a role in decision making, and how memory sometimes helps and sometimes hinders our decision making depending on the accuracy of our memories. This was back in the late 90s, and so the study of neuroscience was really starting to come into psychology then. So the availability of things like fMRI brain imaging started to be available to psychologists, and that just seemed to me really interesting development because one I think downside of the psychological models is that they were largely a black box where the brain was, and it's like some magic happens here and the decision is output, but it wasn't very clear what kind of processes actually went on to arrive at the decision. And neuroscience and fMRI in particular seem to offer a way of constraining our models by the biology. And so I had an opportunity to do some fMRI studies as a final year PhD student. And that really, I think, set me on a path of trying to integrate the psychological and neuroscientific aspects to build these models.
Right. I mean, you had one in the field, you had one very super influential paper very early on. Okay, I would say early on. If I look back, can you tell us a bit about that study? Because it was, I thought it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, it turned out to be quite influential. It didn't. We didn't think that at the time, and it largely came about. I think one of the very positive aspects of academia is occasionally people are freed up just to think and do stuff, which may seem to be a little bit crazy or a little bit not immediately relevant. And I was lucky enough in my postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton in the US. I had a situation where I already had a faculty position, which I deferred. And so I had a kind of a 2-year postdoc, which was risk-free. I could kind of do whatever I wanted.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't worried about a job market or strategically positioning myself to get a job. I could just do what I wanted.
That doesn't happen often.
That doesn't happen often. It was a very nice circumstance. And allied to that was I was in a lab where I was a little bit of a peripheral member. So the lab was really interested in a process called cognitive control, or how we exert control about our cognition. But the PI of the lab had a kind of a side interest in decision making, and he just thought it'd be fun to have a decision making researcher there. So I got that position, and I happened to be in an office with an anthropologist who was also interested in these kind of broader questions. And our projects really came out of kind of spitballing over beers and come up with ideas that we thought, well, we have the opportunity. We were literally beside the scanner. Nobody was using the scanner. And so we could just go in and play around. So it was really, it was really playtime. I mean, when I read sometimes about some of these tech companies who let their employees devote certain percentage of their time to play, it reminds me of that time, except I had 100% of my time. And so we got interested in the notion of how people make decisions when they're interacting with other people. Mm-hmm. And so concepts like cooperation and coordination and competition. So how do decisions change when other people are involved? And one thing I've always been very interested in is the concept of inequality and unfairness. That always seemed to be a remarkably strong motivating force in people's behavior. If people feel they're being treated unfairly, they're often willing to, go to great lengths to try and address that or punish the people who are treating them badly, often way beyond what the actual resource they're being treated unfairly about. I mean, you see it in children. If children feel their brother or sister gets more or less than them, you can really see how strong and aversive a feeling it is. So very visceral. It is, yeah. And so we were interested in seeing, could we study that in the lab? Could we make people feel unfairly treated? And what would that do in the brain? Could we make sense of that neurally? And we presented some ideas at one of our lab meetings, and Danny Kahneman, who it was nice to meet, one of your heroes. He happened to be sitting in on the lab meeting. Wow. And one day he just said, you should look at this game called the ultimatum game. That really gets at this kind of thing. We had never heard of the ultimatum game, which turned out to be a game proposed in experimental economics, which wasn't super well known at the time, but we went off and investigated. And it turned out it was a quite nice task to enable us to put people into these situations where they felt unfairly treated. So in short, the ultimatum game is a task where you and your partner, who you don't know, so another person, are asked to share $10 between you. Your partner can make any proposal as to how this money can be shared. And then you have to decide whether this is a reasonable thing to do or not. So we were interested in situations where the partner offered you a very low amount. So he or she said, I'm going to keep $9 and I'm going to give you $1. So you're faced with this situation now where this very unfair division has been proposed, and you can decide to either accept this offer. You get $1, they get $9, and the game is over. Mm-hmm. Or you can reject the offer, in which case nobody gets anything. And to every model of economics that exists, this is a trivial choice. It's not even a choice, right? Because if you accept, you get $1. If you reject, you get $0. Right. So you would always accept. But as it turns out, and as we've seen now thousands and thousands of times, people don't behave this way. So when people are confronted with this choice, more than half the time they say, no, I don't want any part of this, right? Mm-hmm. I'd rather have nothing and you get nothing than we have this unfair division. And so I think that shows the the profound effect of this feeling of unfairness. So we were interested in studying this. We did many experiments. And in particular, we looked at what happens in the brain when people experience this moment of unfairness. And we found a nice network of brain areas that we've since replicated many, many times that started to give us some kind of toehold into how the brain encodes complex, I would say, moral emotions such as kind of unfairness, injustice, and so on. I think we were lucky when that paper came out. It happened at just the right time. People were really interested in neuroscience and fMRI. People were really interested in decision making. We managed to merge these two, and the papers turned out to be at least well cited over the years. And,
right.
And it took me off in a whole research direction, which I certainly hadn't anticipated when I showed up at Princeton.
Right.
But when I left, I had a whole kind of research path looking at these social influences. So going beyond unfairness to other social motivations. But I guess that's what kickstarted. And it was largely happenstance. I happened to be in the right place at the right time and was able to take advantage of that. So that was a good start.
And you were allowed to play.
And that's turned out to be extremely important. I had other friends who went off to postdocs who didn't have the either resources I had or the freedom, or they didn't allow themselves the freedom, I think, sometimes to just study what's inherently interesting to you, because that's, of course, it's hard to beat the motivation of studying something you're just really interested in.
Right. And just to a follow-up question, when people thought they play against some type of machine, they would accept low offers.
Yeah, so that turned out to be interesting. So initially, we also had people play against the machine because we kind of had the idea that what's driving this feeling is that somebody else is treating you badly.
Right.
Not that I'm being treated unfairly per se, but somebody is kind of trying to screw me here.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that was the real reason why people got so upset. And so almost as a test, we had people also play against computers. So we told them a computer will randomly make you an offer, and that offer may be fair or unfair, and then you have to make a decision. Initially, to our surprise, quite a few people actually rejected offers from computers also.
Oh.
In that they were told this box will generate a random number and that's what you get. And you can say yes or no. And a lot of people said no. What we realized afterwards was that this was a very kind of initial reaction. So if we told people just wait 5 seconds and then tell us, then everybody said yes.
Oh, right.
But and by doing kind of these experiments where we can vary the identity of the person or thing making the offer, we kind of start to see that there's a very initial and, as you used, I think, a really good word for it, visceral reaction to unfairness, that if I'm being treated badly, I'm going to do something about it. Now, if I'm given it seconds to think, okay, this computer clearly isn't targeting me for unfair treatment, I can do the, quote, correct thing. But there's a certain sense of people are very sensitive to this feeling of being unfairly treated and can often crowd out even
being taken advantage of, kind of.
Yes. And we've done many other experiments to find out what is it about these unfair offers that really makes people feel so mad, and it turns out to be indeed that sense of being taken advantage of. So if you're told the other person only can make you this offer, you usually say, okay, that's fine. I don't think the other person is trying to hurt me. But
it's not intentional.
So the intentions turn out to be really important,
right,
in this case.
Now, that has been, when did that paper come out?
That came out in 2003.
2003. Now, that was kind of the I shouldn't say starting point, but when Decision Neuroscience became bigger and bigger and like really a big part on the map of what's possible and areas that is going to be covered. Now, ever since then, I mean, the field has been grown so much. And of course, it's, as you said before, it's super interdisciplinary. You have behavioral economists looking into this. You have also let's just call them, in air quotes, standard economists looking into this. Everyone, of course, with a slightly different framework of trying to understand. Are these different groups ever talking to each other?
Yes. I mean, one of the one of the big differences in the past, almost 20 years now, is that there's actually a quite thriving academic society called a Society for Neuroeconomics, which is a word I don't particularly like. I much prefer Decision Neuroscience, but the society is called the Society for Neuroeconomics, and I'm currently the president of it. So I can't badmouth the term too much.
I should know that.
We have a meeting upcoming in Dublin, actually, in October, our annual meeting, and we expect about 350 people there.
Wow!
So that's a society that's really emerged. I think this is our 17th meeting. So it's a very new academic society. And we indeed draw economists, psychologists, neuroscientists, occasionally sociologists, anthropologists, quite a few people from business schools, so in marketing and management. So that's actually been really encouraging to see that people are willing to talk, and more than just talk, actually actively collaborate and, try and build these models that take advantage of the various strengths of the component disciplines. So, it's still small in relation to, a large field like neuroscience, but I think it's positive. It's growing every year. And so there's a sense, I think, that people are seeing the benefits of interdisciplinary collaboration more than just paying lip service to it, but are actually willing to do it.
Yeah, as long as it actually happens, right?
And that's the trick. I mean, everybody says it's great, and every grant says it should be interdisciplinary, and I think sometimes then we minimize the difficulties. It's quite difficult to do. I mean, you can spend an entire conference just getting the sense of what people are talking about. So I was recently at a workshop in the US on kind of the theme of kind of social inequity, social inequality, which I thought, well, I study this, I should know all this. And there were people from many different disciplines and just with completely different perspectives on these things, very interesting perspectives, but quite different. And so it took us literally a day and a half to even arrive at the same page where we could have a useful conversation, because people are talking from very different levels, very different approaches. So interdisciplinariness is hard, but worthwhile. And so when it actually occurs, I think you can see the benefits.
Right. Now, wait, is this the same conference? That's the Neuroeconomics conference.
The one that's
the one you mentioned at the beginning,
yes.
Right? Okay. So then I have been to that one when it was in Miami.
Okay.
That's been quite some time ago.
Yes. That was, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We've been in Miami a few times.
Oh, okay.
So,
Well, it's nice there.
Yes.
And it's in this big hotel. You have this great view.
Yeah, it's no great hardship to go to a conference in Miami.
No, for sure not. Yeah. But when you look at the field, what are some of the latest findings, or a finding, which you think is very, very exciting? One of the most recent ones, or doesn't have to be from the past year, can also be from, past 5 or 10 years, but where you think, okay, this really is a big step forward.
Yeah, I think it's more probably a constellation of findings. And, aside from my own subfield of looking at, say, social decisions, there's been a lot of progress in understanding valuation, I think. So understanding how we encode the value of a particular choice prior that we have to make it, right? So I'm given a choice. I can go to Miami or I can go to Dublin. I have to kind of get some essence of what will the value of each of these options be before I decide what to do. And there's been, I think, really a lot of progress in really understanding the mechanisms of how that valuation process works. So what goes into me coming up with a feeling of value for Miami versus Dublin, for example? What are the kind of psychological inputs? And then also what are the kind of neurochemicals that are involved in processing that? So how does dopamine help us encode that? So there's been a lot of work on that. And that's really been quite interdisciplinary. So work from rodents, where we can really track these chemicals and these brain areas, all the way up to kind of work from economics, from very theoretical way of thinking about it. And they're starting to map onto each other, I think, in really interesting ways. So that's one area that there's been a lot of progress. Within my own area of social decision making, there's been a lot of progress in modeling these interactions in a really meaningful way. So not just going beyond saying if people are unfairly treated, they'll be upset and they'll make a a certain type of decision and that certain brain areas are involved, but actually building up models saying what are the key factors in these decisions, what is the brain networks involved, how might this differ as a function of, say, social context or emotional context, what are the individual differences that might play a role. So it's really kind of building up much richer models of the decision process. I think that's where the progress has been made, and I think that's the direction we'll potentially see most progress in the future.
Right, and but the modeling doesn't only hold for the social decision making, right?
No, and indeed the modeling, it's probably late to the party, social decision making, for the modeling. So the modeling really is started off with individual choice, so very simple choices, right? If I have a choice between an apple and an orange, seemingly almost, overly simplistic, but we can start there and start building up models of how do we do that valuation up to more complex sets of choices.
Now, you mentioned specifically valuation, that a lot of progress has been happening there. Now, when it comes to valuation, I think you put it very, very nicely as like, hey, do you want to go to Miami or, sorry, what did you say?
Dublin.
Well, I mean,
always go to Dublin.
Always go to Dublin. If you're in Europe, go to Dublin.
Anywhere, go to Dublin.
If anywhere you go to
Unless
Dublin.
You're in Dublin, then you should go to Miami.
Right. That's of course, that's always possible. But when it comes to valuation, right? I mean, you gave this example of, okay, Dublin versus Miami. Now, there's this talk, and people can, of course, look this up on YouTube, where Dan Ariely talks about decoys. And I thought that was, or I think most people in the industry know this maybe more like as nudging. And I thought this was very interesting, what that does to the valuation process.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about that? I find that quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting you raise it, because I think we don't know what it's. So the idea behind a decoy is you put a slightly lesser appealing option in, and it can actually change people's preferences somewhat, right? So if I'm choosing between Miami and Dublin, I may be fairly indifferent. But if I give you a slightly worse European city, I'm not going to badmouth a particular European city. Somewhere that's not quite as nice as Dublin. Even though it's never really in the running for being chosen, it may push you towards Dublin, because by comparison it looks better. Yeah. And of course, marketers are well aware of this trick and have been using this for many, many years. I think these are the areas actually that we still have to make progress in, is understanding mechanistically how these decoys actually work. So why would that necessarily lead to a change in valuation for the ultimately preferred option? And I think that's where we're starting to see the interdisciplinary nature hopefully having effect. So, we know these things from psychology and from marketing, and neuroscientists now are starting to take them seriously. So I think previously, maybe they had thought them as they're kind of like these little tricks that psychologists can play, right? And you get to shift some preferences a little bit, but maybe they aren't. They're, parlor tricks basically, as opposed to really meaningful examples. I think they're more meaningful than just tricks. And it's starting, I think, to filter into the research where people are interested in understanding how this works. Not so much to understand how this works, but again, maybe to come back to our earlier example of a cognitive illusion, how this helps us understand the system better. So what are the factors, for example, that go into valuation, right? This suggests that some kind of comparison process is important too. So it's interesting you bring that up, because I think that's the next phase now of where we want to understand these I guess aspects of decision making that marketers and lawyers and salespeople are well aware of from a practical perspective. I think it's quite interesting to try and understand that from a brain/behavioral perspective, with the view again of building up better models of the system.
Yeah. Do you think it would be useful to look at it from the perspective or viewpoint of perception research? Because that's what I used to do. And when you mention illusions, you just tweak a little bit of the sensory input you're providing, and the illusion is altered. And even though it's the same illusion, but it's not perceived the same way, and you just tweaked one tiny parameter a little bit, and basically throwing off your reference, and now you have a new reference, which then, because of that, changes the illusion.
No, I think that's a good approach, and I think that's this whole program of heuristics and biases, the Kahneman diversity approach, was really explicitly derived from perceptual research, the exact same way, right? We look at the inputs and we look at see where the system is, tricked, and what does that tell us? And so I think certainly perception provides a good fundamental basis for this. And sometimes our decisions are, the perception is the reason. Sometimes it's memory, sometimes it's attention. So, but I think that approach is a good one.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. No, I would. If I had to think about it, I think I would tackle it from a systems theory perspective. But we can talk about that later. Yeah. We don't have to talk about this now. It's my curiosity coming out. Sorry. Okay, but you mentioned that nudging and these, let's just say again in air quotes, lots of these tricks are being used so much in marketing or sales, advertising, and actually all over the place if you are aware of it, of these principles. Do you think there are some of these principles which are used a lot? I mean, talked about a lot as in their usefulness in industry, but seem to you as if they are being misunderstood?
Misunderstood in the sense of what? So we can
break it down as in one, concept, and two, effectivity.
Okay, I think from the first perspective, I wonder, does anybody care, like in industry, whether they conceptually understand the decoy effect or not? Because I always under the impression if it works, it works.
Right.
Or you perceive that it works.
Right.
Why it works is less interesting, right? That's kind of the province of science to understand.
Right.
Effectiveness, I think that's a really good question. And, I have colleagues in marketing that I discussed this with at length. And personally, I don't know how effective these things are because I've never seen really good data on the effectiveness of a decoy. I know it works in a lab setting. It works for some number of people in a lab setting. I think that's another important point. Often these things are portrayed as being kind of universally effective. They're usually not, right? They work on more people choose Dublin after another European city is introduced than if not, but it's not a wholesale shift from 0 to 100%.
Right.
So it works, I think, at the margins, and I think all of these nudges work at the margins to some degree. Perhaps they're additive, that you can pile a few nudges on top of each other and they'll be more effective. But I guess I'm a little skeptical about the overall effectiveness of these nudges, to use a kind of a generic term, without seeing them kind of really rigorously tested in the real world. I believe they work in a lab environment. Do they work in a real world at places that marketers would be interested? I just don't know. And I guess there probably isn't data that's I'm sure there's data that's proprietary, but there's no data easily available for people like me to look and say, okay,
I was about to say they would. I don't know any company that does it that would be willing to share.
Of course. If you have insight into this, it's a competitive advantage. And why would you, I guess?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, then let me rephrase then what I meant with concept. I think what I meant was not necessarily mechanistically how it works, but to know enough about the theory to apply it into practice.
Okay. Yeah, I honestly don't know. That's something, I guess, in my sense would be probably, I honestly don't know. It's always a bit of a mystery to me how much people in industry know, where they get their information from, how much of it is based on, say, primary articles or primary sources versus how much is gleaned from, the Sunstein and Thaler book and blogs and
It's more that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and so then, things often, of course, get misrepresented somewhat once they even in papers sometimes they're misrepresented. So once they go away from that, I think it's very easy for people to think, oh, there's this nudge that just works. And I think I think the whole nudges I feel a bit ambivalent about, because on one hand I think they've been really useful in demonstrating to, for me, my interest would be more in policy than in business, but to both of those fields, nudges have been really useful in demonstrating the usefulness of studying human behavior, studying psychology, basically, and what that can add to our understanding of decision making and how it can be applied to help people make better decisions, ideally. But I think there have been a little bit overhyped at the same time.
Yeah.
And so my fear is that at some point people say, well, these don't quite have the benefits that they've been promised, and you kind of get this backlash. And
exactly. I mean, neuromarketing had the same backlash. Mm-hmm. And I actually think well deserved because it just went. It's similar to what you described. It was so hyped up, and actually, it doesn't only hold for neuromarketing. Actually, anything that is so hyped up and so much expectation is put onto it, it's just sooner or later going to implode.
Yeah.
Even if it worked, but the expectations are just so high.
Yeah. I mean, I have some sympathy for people trying to use, science in industry because, I think the goals are quite different. So, in science, we're looking for, to sound very pretentious, we're looking for truth, right? We'd like to know some baseline knowledge that we feel, okay, this is how the system works, whether this is what the system outputs in behavior, or this is how the system works in mechanisms. But that's kind of our goal. Of course, in industry, the goal is somewhat different, right? And each industry or each application will have a separate goal. But I remember a conversation I had a long time ago with a neuromarketer, a famous neuromarketer, and their idea was that, well, no, we don't. And I was using the scientific. I was on my scientific soapbox, basically saying, you can't possibly tell anything to any degree of statistical certainty from, putting 4 people in a scanner and showing them a commercial.
Sure not.
You just can't do that.
No.
And they, after some point they said, okay, that's true. And I agree with you. However, what I'm trying to do is give executives, advertisers information, and they don't necessarily require it to be beyond reasonable statistical certainty, right? They just, if it's a preponderance of the evidence, or if it's a hint in favor of one commercial versus another commercial, that's what they need.
But
so that did made me realize that the criteria are quite different.
The criteria are different, but I would disagree with him. That is what those people would want.
Yeah.
But you can only do that if you have enough statistical power, even if it's just a hint. I would rather say that this is a question of effect size and not statistical significance per se.
Mm-hmm. I think from a statistical perspective, yeah, you're right. I think from their perspective, it was like, okay, we won't get bogged down in technicalities, but they were saying, if we have a value of P.2, right, which in a scientific paper that would be
nothing
laughed at, right?
There's nothing.
People would not take that seriously. They were saying we view this as there's some evidence for commercial A over commercial B, and they were going to present it to the executives. We can't be sure, but at least there's some hint that the brain prefers commercial A over commercial B, and their argument was that's useful information to know. And if the executives want to take that on board, or if they were just going to flip a coin anyway, why not use this?
Right. Okay, I agree with providing the executives with this type of information, but I do think that type of threshold is the wrong one to pick. but
yes,
that's
I agree with you on that. There are other ways of approaching.
There are other ways of how you can approach it. And
but I guess what it struck me at the time, and what stuck with me was that the concept kind of opened my eyes a bit. It's just a different. You have different goals, right? You're not trying to discover the truth. You're trying to, help make a decision about a particular advertising campaign or a particular way of promoting your product or whatever.
Right.
And so I have to have a little bit more sympathy for neuromarketing.
No, it's the same. This, what you're describing now is also something that I had to realize over time, slowly, because when we started, I was this has to be done by the book properly. Yeah. And the more I tried to do it by the book, the more the industry actually asked me, why are you doing it this way?
Yeah.
We don't understand what you just put here on the screen. Yeah. What are all these gray shadings around these curves?
Right.
And my answer was, that's the standard error. And they asked, what's that?
Yeah.
So I tried to explain it. And after I used the word distribution, it was clear this was more confusing than helpful.
Yeah.
And they just asked, hey, can you remove it? So I removed it and they literally said, isn't this better already? So, I mean, when I started to understand what you said, basically, that they are just trying to, they want to use data to use it in order to make a decision.
Yes.
And the decision can be fairly simple. It's not about any mechanisms.
Yes.
It's not about any of those
really,
highly complex models.
A or B, basically.
It's exactly A, B, or maybe a C is in there, but it's in essence just a comparative thing. And that you then also can have a comparison across, previous other commercials, let's say, just as a benchmark, which that took me a while to wrap my head around, and how to actually do that while not feeling I completely abandon the
that seems quite difficult.
The statistical not properties. That's the statistical
rigor. I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in all honesty, sometimes when they say we don't care about this, I'm like, well, okay, then that's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult. I mean, we've been approached a few times here at the Donders about, doing research which is more applied or in the kind of neuromarketing area. And I found it ultimately impossible to do both research that I felt was kind of scientifically rigorous to a standard I'd feel comfortable writing a paper about.
Right.
And gave the customer, in a sense, what they wanted, because once you start listing, this is the requirement of you want to know A or B. Okay, well, it's going to take me 3 studies, each with 50 people. It's going to take 2 years.
Right.
And then I'm going to give you a conditional answer. Yeah. It might be A, or there's a good chance it's B. And then it's like, well.
And it's going to cost you a fortune.
Yeah, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So in the end, I think it's just really hard to do both. I think it's, for me, I think it's impossible to do both. I don't think, they're just two different things. I mean, that's been the tricky thing when I've been to a few neuromarketing conferences, and that's the one thing I found difficult is when people have a foot in both camps. I think that's quite hard to do, because I think you invariably have to put your weight on one foot, and then the other side is going to be unbalanced, I think. But I don't know, is that common in the industry? Do people really think of them as, okay, there's industry and science and they don't have that much to say to each other?
That was my experience.
Yeah.
That they really don't talk. But I have to say, it's neither of them are at fault.
No, I don't think there's a fault here.
The scientists really try to. It just, unfortunately, whatever insights or let's say new findings come out of science, it just often doesn't sound newsworthy to the media outlets, and those are the ones that often
right. So everything is going to get filtered through the media, basically.
Not only,
right.
But it's really. So, for example, we collaborate with a few market research companies or UX testing companies and so on. And they have been very curious about scientific concepts of decision making. So they have asked me if I can give them courses in it. And I literally told them, like, look, this is not my field of expertise. Like a good scientist would say, yes. This is not my field of expertise. Yeah. And they said, well, I'm sure after you read that book, you understand more than we do. That's also fair.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
that's reasonable. Yeah. So then I worked through the neuroeconomics book.
Okay, yeah.
That was quite interesting. Learned a few not new tools, but different ways of looking at it. So that was, I learned something for sure.
Yeah.
And then when I taught them, they were just blown away with all this information of, okay, now we talked a little bit about nudges, about biases, set size, default options, and so on. And so I kept talking, and they were really like, all this information is out there? Like, yes. And it's not even very new.
Yeah. No, that's an experience I've had multiple times now that's I think I think me and many scientists think that, what we know is, well, everybody must know this, but the basic stuff, not the detailed mechanism. But
that's also what I kept thinking, and it's just not right.
Time and time again, I've given general audience talks, and to intelligent audiences, and also sometimes to audiences in a specific domain. So I've talked to like insurance companies about risk. And I would go in thinking, I'm not going to be able to tell an insurance company anything about risk. I mean, that's their principal business is understanding risk.
In theory.
And I mean, maybe that's true at an institutional level. But at an individual level, I mean, I've given talks, which is very basic psychology and neuroscience of risk. And people have been really like, we had no idea about that. And I recently at an environmental conference and talked about some very basic psychological principles to a very well-educated and accomplished audience. And it was all completely new to them. So I think scientists have done quite a bad job outside some of the popular science books. Have done quite a bad job about getting out the message of these are pretty foundational principles.
Yeah.
We don't need to talk about every edge case and every new finding, but we know basically, we know a lot about how the decision process works. And I think we've done a poor job of making that available to people who could use the information. So for me, as I said, I'm interested in policy and how policy decisions can be better informed. And that's, I think, an area that we need to do much, much better in.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I just think that we know a lot about how people make choices. And often policy is about helping people make better choices for them / their country, their environment, and so on. And the knowledge that we have usually isn't present in these policies. And often policies are dominated by economists who've studied decision making, but from quite a different perspective. This idea of optimal decision making, right? The people who would
the rational agent
take any amount of money offered to them in an ultimatum game, because $1 is always better than $0.
Right.
And that's the kind of the model. The rational model is used as kind of, this is how people will decide if we give a policy to them. Often it's in the area of incentives, where that's the economists, I'd say, primary tool is we'll incentivize people to do something, right? And sometimes that works. So we can charge money for a plastic bag at the supermarket, and people will use less plastic bags. That can work quite well.
Sorry for interrupting you, but just if I understand correctly, when it comes to incentives, I mean, there's not only monetary incentive, right?
Yeah, no.
But that's what they mostly use.
They typically use financial monetary incentives, right?
But there's also like ethical and moral and social incentives.
I mean, that's one area of research that we're very interested in at the moment, the social incentives. So can you incentivize and promote good behavior using social motivations? And you can. And, if everyone who recycled got a gold star, right, that would have an effect. We've done some experiments demonstrating that. So that's an example, I think, of where neuroeconomics can make a decision neuroscience can have a role to play in understanding kind of behavior better and trying to, I don't want to use the word nudge, but at least alter behavior in a way that's kind of for the greater good. And so that's a direction we're taking in my lab. Recently, we're interested in questions of inequality and poverty and environmental sustainable behavior. And so how can we use what we've learned, not just from us, but from the field, to kind of better inform? And that turns out to be difficult, because you have to, maybe similar to the professionals you mentioned in industry, they're often not aware of these findings. So you have to somehow get access to them. You have to make the findings compelling and understandable. With the risk of that you simplify down to a unacceptable degree. So it's a difficult or it's a challenging road to take, but I think it's one that's really important.
I totally agree with you. And to my surprise, I constantly thought that we need to, so from the scientist's perspective, when we communicate something, we need to, in again, air quotes, dumb it down or simplify it. And then running the risk of, okay, it's not one, it cannot make any sense anymore if you do that too far, or it's actually not accurate anymore. Either way is not great. But I started the more I was talking to people in industry, they actually didn't want this at all. Mm-hmm. I thought that's what they were demanding.
But actually it wasn't. They wanted to know, maybe not the details, the technicalities from the scientist's perspective, but just enough so they can grasp it. They didn't mind if it's complex.
Yeah.
They actually liked that. So just from my experience, I would say it's actually, again, some media outlet in between that says, oh no, you have to make this short and snappy. People have less time. Yeah. This needs to be a 1 minute read. How much do you learn in 1 minute? Nothing. Yeah. Nothing.
No, I think that's a good insight, that I think people aren't afraid of complexity. I mean, especially when you're talking about human behavior, I think if you come up with some glib one-liner about how, we can get people to do X by doing Y, it's also implausible, right? We're not quite that simple. So I think it's a good suggestion to not necessarily remove all complexity. I think it has to be compelling. I think as scientists, the other disadvantage maybe we have as scientists, that we're very reluctant to state anything with any degree of certainty, because, well, we know that it's impossible to prove things. So it's very hard to get a scientist to stand up and say, I am sure that if you do this other thing will happen, right? It's always couched in some degree of likelihood or probability, which is what we're trained to do. And, that's often not what a policymaker does not want to hear.
That's true.
They want to hear, okay, I want people to recycle. Tell me what I need to do to get them to do that.
Yeah.
And I think as scientists, maybe we have to be willing to, put our money where our mouth is a little bit and say, okay, here's a policy recommendation that you should carry out, and we believe it will have the best chance of achieving this outcome, as opposed to being saying just, well, here's the data, we don't know. That's not.
See you later.
I mean, economists are quite good at being sure of themselves and sure of their models, and maybe we need to take a leaf out of their book too.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, I'm not necessarily saying, I also, during my PhD time, I've been told way too often, you sound way too confident about what you're doing, about these findings and so on. But I mean, I was thinking a bit more I think what the policymakers would like, or not only policymakers, people in industry, to have it a bit more concrete. Mm-hmm. So as in, let's say you have a nudging effect, just as we talked about this. Let's say you have a nudging effect of you have product A, you have product B, and what is it, 50-50 normally in the purchasing. Yeah. You add product C, which is, of course, nobody is going to buy that because it's the inferior product, but it shifts towards, let's say, 30% now choose for product A and 70% choose for product B. That's quite an effect size. Mm-hmm. And if we were to just take the experiments, to take the effect size and say, well, if we do this just from the experiments we did, given what your numbers are, this is what the direction of the outcome would be. Yeah. I think they would already be much more convinced than, and even though you still hesitate a little bit, you don't say this is what's going to happen for sure, but a shift in that direction is likely going to happen.
Sure. Yeah. I think you can have some confidence in that. Yeah. I mean, I think the concreteness is an interesting point, because I think another reason for maybe the reluctance of scientists to make confident predictions about industry or policy is that, the nature of our experiments and the nature of our experiments they're extremely well controlled.
That's true.
We try and strip away any bit of context that might be, in our minds, confounding or confusing or affect the result. So we want to only focus on the exact variable that we can manipulate. So in the case of an ultimatum game, if we're interested in whether the person who offers you the money is a man or a woman, that's all we change, right? Or if we're interested in knowing, does it make a difference if it's $10 or $100, that's all we change. Mm-hmm. Or if with your products, you make sure all the products are, equally visible for the same, we even change for different people, see them in different visual positions. So we make everything as controlled as possible so we can make some inference from our results. And I think once then we have to talk about decision making in the real world, whether that be in the supermarket or in government, we're well aware that there's all of a sudden now 100 other factors that come into play that we have no idea how they interact with this one thing that we've measured. And I think that's a cause for uncertainty in scientists, and I think it's also a reason we should be doing experiments where we try and start to build context back in, right? We have a good understanding of the basic mechanisms of the decoy effect. Well, now let's start studying this in as more and more realistic fashion as we can and see, is the decoy effect overwhelmed by some very basic attentional process, or is it overwhelmed by the type of product it is? So I think that has to be the next stage of research, where we've gone to strip everything down so we can do an experiment. Now we need to start kind of building it back up again.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I think that'd be useful too.
I mean, it makes total sense to you try to break it down, understand the little parts, and then try to see how they interact. Yeah. Right? That makes total sense to me.
We've done very well with the first part. We're very good at experiments, and we're very good at isolating the one thing we want to look at. But then we don't tend to, we take a real life problem, we distill it down to an experimental scenario. But what we don't typically do is go back to the real life problem again. So we kind of stay down in our little scientific hole a bit. And I think we could do a better job of coming back closer to real decisions that people are faced with.
And can you name a few examples where industry or whoever, implemented it, used decision-making theory in an applied setting to actually cause some type of behavioral change for the better of whatever they wanted to achieve?
I guess I'm not sure about industry. That's you'd know better than me.
Or government.
I know there has been some initiatives in government that to make use of some of these facts we've learned about decision making. So you mentioned earlier defaults. So we know that, for example, defaults tend to be quite powerful. People will typically choose a default option over switching to something else. And one well-known example is the people willingness to sign up for organ donation. And for many years, this was kind of idiosyncratic by country. So some countries, it was the default that you were a donor unless you explicitly said, I do not want to donate my organs. So that was the case, I think, in places like Belgium. Places like the Netherlands up until recently had the opposite default. That is, you had to actively sign up and say, I want to donate my organs after I die. And so what happened is, from an economic theory point of view, this is a kind of a trivial. The decision to either tick the box or not shouldn't really matter. People's preferences should be to either donate their organs or not. And the mechanism of whether you're automatically in or automatically out should be a very small amount. Turns out it has a huge impact. So it was, something like a 5-fold difference between countries in willingness to donate organs, depending on whether they were opt-in or opt-out.
Wow.
Where obviously, the more effort you had to go to.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and so that has changed. So the Netherlands are thinking of moving towards an opt-out system where you're automatically in unless you do something. So, and that's going to change kind of public health in a I think a pretty dramatic way. There's been other examples of defaults in the US where people have been automatically enrolled in retirement schemes where a certain percentage of their money goes to retirement. And, the higher the default, people just kind of leave it like that. And you can have people actually almost unwittingly save quite a bit more money by changing a default. The other one that I know of that I think is going to be quite important is the idea of social comparison and social norms. And this is a bit closer to my own research, where we know that people can be quite influenced by the behavior of other people, right? And the behavior, and also what they view as the kind of norm of behavior in a particular country, right? So, from your homeland, right? If you stand at a pedestrian crossing and you stand there until the little green man comes on, right?
Sure.
And otherwise, you'll stand there forever.
Yes.
Whereas
That's how the Germans do it.
Yes. Whereas you go somewhere like Ireland, where I'm from, people would look at you as though you're insane if you just stood there and there's no cars coming. It's like, you just cross the road. And, from going back and forth between these countries, I tend to conform with the norm. So when I'm in Germany, I stand there with everybody else. Even when there's nobody there, I stand there because that's kind of the norm in this country. And so I think people are starting to recognize you can take advantage of these norms and these social factors to try and motivate behavior. So I think one nice example is they did a big test in this in the US where people got their energy bill every month. And in addition to being told you used X kilowatts of energy or so on, and they were also told how much you use relative to your neighbors. Because people have no real sense of, is this a good amount or bad amount if they're just given a number of kilowatts.
Yeah. Right? The benchmarking basically comes in here. Right?
Yeah, and so the benchmarking was you're using more or less than your neighborhood average.
Yeah.
And that was all. So there was no sense of this is good or bad, just this is the case. And what they found was that people who, of course, used more energy than their average tended to reduce their energy accordingly. So people wanted to be kind of closer to the norm, closer to the average, and move down. Now, one issue, of course, with nudges is that you're not always nudging people in the right direction. So this worked, but the problem was there was also people who used less energy than average every month. And what they found with those people is they start using more. So there was a perception that, you're kind of supposed to use the average, and if I'm well under average, I'm going to start, blow drying my hair every morning and leaving the fridge open or whatever.
Don't have to feel bad about it.
Yeah. So I use more. And so this is called, we call this a boomerang effect, where there was a good intention, which turned out to be bad. So in the second set of studies, they used this social norm, but they also used some kind of social labeling. So the second round, they gave people also, this is your neighborhood average and you're below or above. But when people were below the neighborhood average, they got a little smiley face, right? So it was like a good job, you're doing good. When they were below the average, when they were above the average, they got the frowny face, right? It's like, you should do something about this.
I get one of those.
There you go.
Not the negative smiley face.
You get the smiley.
But there is a smiley on my energy bill. I mean, I can tell. There are smileys on it.
You just need a smiley. You must be doing good if there's a smiley. And in that test, it had the desired effect. So people who use more than average tended to reduce to the average. People who use less than average stayed below the average because they were getting their smiley face as a reward. And so I think that's a nice example of where you're not going to cause radical changes in energy use, but you get enough and at scale that it can actually have a real effect.
Right.
So, and also it's basically free to the provider. So it's free to the energy company. You don't need to give any kind of financial rewards for reducing energy. It kind of happens naturally as a consequence of people's willingness and desire to follow these norms. So I think that's going to be, these kind of interventions, I think, have potential, at least up until people feel they're being tricked, which I think is another an issue with nudges, that people can feel manipulated quite easily, right? And sometimes it has the opposite effect, or you feel okay, the government are trying to tell me what I should do.
And then the trust is gone.
Yeah, so I think there may be a limited range of areas where these are useful, things like public health maybe, or environmentally sustainable behavior, where most people agree this is pretty much a good thing to do. But it can, I think, if these things overreach, with extreme taxes on sodas, which some governments have tried to do, that hasn't worked so well. So I think there still needs to be research on what are the limits of people's willingness to trust, as you say, and also feel not tricked and manipulated.
Yeah. Talking about a boomerang effect. So this is the story how I heard it. I mean, whoever's listening, please correct me if you hear something wrong. There's a fair chance this is actually not true. But what I heard was that before on Wall Street, there was no, it was kept secret, the big bonuses and salaries. And then and of course, back then, it was also outrageous how much bonuses and so on have been paid out to executives or managers in certain positions. So the government has made it obligatory that those numbers will be made public, with the idea of, oh no, there's going to be so much public outcry that those executives will be shamed into submission. Yeah. But that's not what happened at all. What happened was that the people working with those executives, they saw, I'm doing the same work. Yeah. How does he get so much more? Yeah. I want more. And that's then what happened. It started to inflate everything even more instead of, it's pulling it down.
I think that's a really good example, if it's true. It's a really good example of how you can enact policy, to have one effect and fail to consider how people will psychologically respond to
and
this.
it's still transparent, by the way. As far as I know, it's still transparent.
But of course, you're gonna, what we started talking about, you're gonna generate these feelings of unfairness and inequality. If I'm doing the same job, maybe even working harder than this guy is making twice the money I am. People really don't like that. I mean, and even if all of a sudden they're perhaps previously pay packet they're perfectly happy with now seems completely inadequate. And how could I possibly live on this? So,
well, I mean, it must feel like you've been taken for a ride.
Yeah, it feels you're being taken advantage of, and someone else is profiting off you. So it generates all these, I think, these cognitions that are not conducive to a happy life. And so but I think there's an example where, psychologists / cognitive neuroscientists / decision neuroscientists kind of, I think, usefully inform on, this is likely to happen if you enact these things. And again, often these policies are based on these economic principles of kind of rationality, which is basically saying I should be happy with my packet. What you're making is irrelevant. But of course, it's far from irrelevant.
It's always a comparison. Yeah, I guess it's. What was it? The neighbor's lawn?
Yeah.
A green is a grass is always greener.
Grass is always greener
on the other side.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
And I think that's
and it's very hard not to look, right? It's not hard not to look in your neighbor's yard. Oh, it's so much greener than mine. So I think that's the nature of us as humans, that we're social animals and we engage in these social comparisons constantly. And it's unrealistic to expect us not to do it. So I think we have to understand how it works, and can we use it to help people as opposed to cause people misery.
Yeah. Talking about fairness, I've seen this I think by now it's a super famous experiment where two monkeys are in the cage and they have to do a certain task, and one monkey gets a grape and the other monkey gets a cucumber. So what happens, whoever has not seen that video, don't worry, it's going to be in the show notes. I'm not going to say the link out now. You can just go to the show notes and then watch it. But what basically happens is, so it starts off with those two monkeys doing that task, and they can also see each other, right?
And that's key.
And that's key. Yeah, that's key. They can see each other. And the first monkey does the task, gets a cucumber, eats the cucumber, all fine. Second monkey does the task, gets the cucumber, eats the cucumber, all fine. Second round, the first monkey starts to get a grape, and the second monkey starts to get a cucumber. Now, the second monkey is very upset about getting a cucumber because the other one just got for the same thing a grape. So given that experiment, and they did plenty of variations with that, it looks like that the concept of fairness does not seem to be a particularly only human thing. Where do you think this type of finding will lead for us reflecting upon ourselves?
Yeah, well, so that's it's a wonderfully entertaining video to watch.
I still watch it.
Yeah, and it's basically a monkey version of the task I started out talking about. It's basically a monkey version of the ultimatum game where people are kind of unequally treated. When the norm or the perception is that they'll be treated the same way. So what I think it shows the fundamental nature of this feeling or state that we're kind of hardwired to object to unfairness. And we've a fairly sophisticated sense of what unfairness is. So it's not necessarily that we don't get the same thing, but it's that we're being treated worse than somebody else when we should be treated the same way. We've done some experiments in children with similar tasks where they're dividing candy between them, and you see similar findings. So it's something that is present early on. It seems to be present in primates. And so I think that shows us that it's a pretty important principle of how we evaluate others' behavior towards us and how we make decisions often.
Right. No, for me, this was, when I saw that video, I just couldn't believe it. It was because this is something normally not talked about so much.
Yeah, no, there's been, I think recently there's quite a bit of interesting work now on these kind of primate social behavior. And, there has been work obviously on primate social interaction and things like hierarchies within primate groups and so on. Looking at social decision-making has been a more recent avenue of research where people have looked at how primates, say, cooperate. Also rodents now, there's some work looking at, say, unfairness and inequality in rodents. So I think people are understanding it may be a lot more fundamental than we think. From our early work in this, one I think interesting contribution of the brain part is that the areas that we found in the brain that were sensitive to unfairness, one was an area called the anterior insula. And this was particularly interesting to us at the time because up until then, people had seen involvement of the anterior insula in quite different kind of processes. And these were processes involved in very sensory discomfort. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I was to poke you with a stick or, set fire to you or make you hungry or make you thirsty, you would see activation. Related. Often pain or physical discomfort or stress or negative affect, basically. Now in our ultimatum game studies, we weren't physically hurting anybody, but people felt kind of, morally injured maybe. And it was interesting to us that we saw the same area involved as had been shown in these much more physical sensory negative affective states. And so it also gets us thinking that, maybe these are quite primary emotions or motivations. They're not necessarily kind of sophisticated cognitive representations, but they may be, we may be quite, at a very basic level, we respond to things like inequality and unfairness.
Yeah. Sticking a little bit to the inequality and unfairness, what do you think is happening or is going to happen when it comes to the future of decision-making and how it is being, let's say the concepts we just talked about, do you think they're going to be regulated at some point? And let me put this in a bit more of a context. If you think of the current social media platforms of using specific perceptual, decision-making, memory, attention tricks based on neuroscientific findings, psychology findings about principles of slot machines. Do you think that and talking about being manipulated, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think that at some point the governing bodies will step in and say, okay, this is going too far?
I don't think so. Just from my opinion as a citizen, I can't see that happening. I think it maybe should be considered. I mean, the principles. It's really interesting to see how many of the social media platforms operate on a system almost perfectly designed to promote constant checking and with intermittent reinforcement, and it's and also not just social media but also things like video games.
Right.
Really.
Right.
It's amazing. My son plays video games sometimes, and I sitting there and I watch and I go, this is like really clever the way they designed this.
Yeah.
It's very hard to resist, especially for developing minds. It's very hard to resist. So, whether there should or shouldn't be regulation, I do think there should be awareness of that the way these media operate are going to encourage a certain type of behavior that can be quite difficult to not adhere to. So I think there should be greater knowledge about that. So when we talk about, say, the power of Facebook or the power of social media, I think there should be better understanding of how they work and what kind of triggers they hit on us and what buttons they press, because they're not designed accidentally. They're designed by smart people who have whether they read the scientific papers or they just have some kind of implicit understanding of how people operate. They really, as I said, hit all the buttons. And so I think it's behooves society that we understand that. And even if we're not going to regulate it, we should at least be able to say, okay, this is why it's hard for people to stay away from these media.
Right.
And I think, again, science could do a better job about getting involved in that. You know, we have a tendency not to get involved in things because we want to stay neutral, and we're just about the truth. And but I think there's certain platforms we could speak up a bit louder in, and again, not necessarily with a value judgment, but just to say, you know, if you're operating an app or a game or a social media platform which gives this intermittent reinforcement and encourages people that you really need to kind of keep up or you're going to miss out, that's going to promote certain behaviors in the population that maybe we want to think about, are they positive or not? Yeah.
No, I like what you said with, I mean, these are very smart people. And I don't remember where I heard this quote, but somebody, maybe it was a friend who said that. It's like, look, the smartest people on the planet, and all they do is try to get you to click on something. And I'm like, that's sad.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some quotes, at least from you know, Silicon Valley people talking about things like dopamine hits, right? So they do have some awareness, I think, of how.
No, I think they are very well aware.
Yeah.
I just think the users are
probably
oblivious to this.
And of course, we could probably think about better use for all this intellect, but
that's true. No, it's I think it's quite interesting because there are studies for some time now, longitudinal studies that look into the effects of social media use on your mental health. And I was very concerned when I read those papers. It's not just one. I mean, they've been replicated and so on. I thought this is alarming. Yeah. And I think then the scientists have nothing to worry about because the data is crystal clear. Yeah. That there's something. I'm not saying regulation. I'm not saying I know what the solution is or something.
Yeah, but of course this isn't new. I mean, we've known this. I mean, slot machines are like a perfectly designed mechanism to keep you coming back and give you just enough reward to keep the temptation going. And we've had slot machines for a long time. So, you know, these are just being applied in a different format and a different scale now. But you know, there's nothing new under the sun, as they say.
I agree. I guess just different packaging, I guess, and it perceptual-wise looks new.
Also with a much bigger outreach, right? Everyone doesn't have a slot machine in their pocket, right? You often, maybe that was a way of implicitly regulating it, right? You create a building that you have to physically show up in and put your money in, and that's maybe one way of kind of implicitly regulating it. That of course goes out the window when, you know, everybody has it in their pocket and on their desk and at home and everywhere. So that changes things.
Yeah, exactly. No, I find that very concerning, and I think it would be great if we all just talked a bit more about this.
Yes. Also, of course, all the people listening to your podcast and their electronic device, that's also good use for these.
Yeah, I think that's a good use. And I hope they're not just sitting around. I hope they're cooking something while listening.
Yes,
that's what I like about the podcast format. You don't have to.
Yeah, it doesn't tie you to your device, right?
Exactly, it doesn't tie you to it. Yeah. You know, I have a follow-up question to what you said before. So you talked about default options, but the examples you gave, they both had a temporal discounting mechanism tied to it. So you gave the example of organ donation, and you gave the example of retirement. Now, both of those are, of course, super long term, and people are terrible at thinking about the future. They often don't even want to do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do default options also have a strong impact if there's no temporal discounting factor?
Yeah, that's
involved?
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that most of the examples do have this sense of I'm choosing now for some outcome in the distant future. I mean, I think they do because, I mean, you go to these internet sites or web forums and there's often an option chosen for you and you just don't click away. And so I think those kind of defaults still work. I think it's a matter of current debate. Why they work, are people too lazy to click away? It's just, I don't want to do it. I'll just do what I'm told. Or do people have this implicit assumption that because something is being defaulted, that somebody has decided that this is the best thing to do, right? So it's a way of basically saying, I trust whoever has defaulted this for me, that this is the best, and I don't care enough to think again. So But I do think they probably do work. I mean, I guess in marketing, there must be quite a lot of knowledge on defaults, right? That if you go to a site or you're trying to purchase something, one thing will be, here's what you can have, or you can choose something else if you want.
Yeah.
So I think there is a power of defaults even in the present domain.
Yeah. All right. Okay. That was just personal curiosity of mine. Just something I noticed.
Yeah, that's a good point on the previous research.
I just have two more questions for you. So the first one is, it's a bit of a segue back because you mentioned the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, I shall say. Yes. I have never met him, unfortunately. And I mean, this book, I hear in industry, I hear this being cited all the time. Mm-hmm. All the time. All I hear is system 1, system 2, really? System 1, system 2. I hear this all the time. And then I hear, system 1 is subconscious, system 2 is conscious. And then like all these labels are just thrown onto these two things. Yeah. Now, what do you think were good things that came out of this book being published? And maybe some quite bad consequences.
Right. So, well, personally, I think more good than bad for sure. So, and the positives are simply exposing this area of research to a broader community. We talked about many people aren't aware of these kind of what people like me in the field will consider really basic and obvious stuff. And much of the research cited in the book is quite old. I mean, it's stuff they've done in the 70s and 80s, and it still stands up. But it's kind of classic findings from judgment and decision-making research. And so I think anything that can be done to bring science in a non-hypey way, which I think is what he does quite well in the book. He doesn't sensationalize and preach, I think is a good thing. It shows how experiments operate, it shows how scientists work, and it shows the kind of conclusions you can draw after a long program of research. So I think that's really positive. The system 1, system 2 thing, I feel has been maybe over
abused.
Yeah, I think people have taken it a little bit more literally than I think it should be. I mean, in my mind, it's
because he does say explicitly in the book. Just to point it out, he explicitly say in the book, these are just concepts to make it easier to understand it from a framework perspective.
Yes,
that's all he says.
But it's very easy to go down the road of thinking, okay, because it makes very nice intuitive sense, and we've had this metaphor for many, many, many years, right? I think it was Aristotle talked about the kind of the voice of reason on the back of the kind of animal of instinct.
Yeah.
And so it's many people have come up with two system models over the years. So it's a very compelling concept that you've got kind of rationality and emotion battling it out, and it kind of captures a little bit. I mean, it's Freudian almost. In a way. Exactly. But I think there's a danger of taking it too literally, is that we literally have a part of the brain that's system 1 and a completely different part of the brain is system 2. And they're somehow, fighting it out all the time.
Which is just not true.
No, it's not true. And we're becoming some of the early research, including some of mine, did talk about this, again, in a kind of a conceptual sense, that we may have areas of the brain that are more predisposed to kind of deliberative cognitive processing, such as areas of the frontal lobe, versus areas of the brain like the anterior insula I mentioned, which seem to be more devoted to more affective processing, but they're certainly not a one-to-one relationship. You asked about recent developments a while ago. I think a very important recent development from a more technical point of view has been this notion of brain networks, that a single brain area isn't going to tell us much, that what we really need to think about is a network of areas working together to perform a function. And I don't think there's very good evidence, or really much evidence, suggesting that there's a system 1 network and a separate system 2 network. Many areas are involved in multiple things. Yeah. So, well, it's a very useful metaphor, and I think it's a very nice concept. I think if people indeed are thinking in terms of how do we activate system 2 in these people, or is system 1 the dominant? I think that's maybe not very useful way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And to be fair to some other authors, who also wrote great books, which is Robert Cialdini's Influence. Mm-hmm. I think it was that was the first book I actually read on this topic.
Yeah,
I was blown away.
That's a great
really
book.
Good.
He's a terrific speaker.
Yeah, and you can. I think the follow-up was Persuasion.
Yeah,
which is also great.
Yeah,
I suggest to read it in that order.
Yes.
Because it does use some concepts of the first one.
And one nice thing Cialdini did, of course.
Cialdini, sorry.
Yeah, I talked earlier about how often we can get stuck down in this little hole of scientific rigor. He has, I think, gone to some quite big efforts to do more what we might call a field study in psychology, where he actually looks at decision making kind of in the wild, in as much as is practically possible, and in conjunction with trying to have scientific rigor, which is a very difficult combination. But I think he's been a really good proponent of those, and so the books feature some really nice examples of that.
And one more that I know of is Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational, which I also enjoyed. So if people want to know a bit more, like other types of resources that are listening, is there something that you can recommend except for the books?
Yeah, I don't really read those books.
You don't really read those books?
I mean, I hopefully should know what's in them, because if I'm reading the books, then that's a bit of a problem. No, I mean, I've read those books. Actually, I've read Nudge. I mean, so they're all doing a nice job at again presenting this research to a general audience, and so I think there's a valuable role to play for those. I think you point out maybe where again an area that scientists could do, I think, a lot better is making their work kind of digestible to a non-scientific audience, and often we don't, or we usually don't do that, and it's left to people like Kahneman and Dan Ariely and Cialdini to translate it in their books, or there's the medium of TED Talks, which I think are often much too simplified and much the style of it. I've given one, so I know how I was told clearly what I was supposed to do, and it's more the E, I think it stands for entertainment in TED.
I have no idea what it stands for.
I think it's technology I don't know, but it's certainly you're supposed to give an entertaining talk, and I think we could do a better job about providing little potted modules on our research that people could find and look at, right? Designed to be informative and somewhat compelling, but not kind of gloss over all the complexities. And that's, I think, a responsibility of scientists to be better at this kind of outreach. We could do.
Well, I mean, coming to my final question, which is actually not one of mine. It's one from a guest from episode number 3, Ivar de Lange, who talked about the UX of cocktails and bars. And when I asked him, if you had a scientist at your disposal who could look into whatever you want, what is it that you would want him to look into, or her look into? And he basically said, what are great menu designs for bars and restaurants? And another one, which was basically, what are great furniture designs and how does posture impact behavior? So on the latter, I don't want to burden you with the latter one, because I actually have no idea who I would have to ask for this one.
Yes.
But on the previous one, the menu designs.
Yeah, well, there are people who study this. I mean, there are psychologists who study menu designs, and they study things like, there's some things, there's I think there's 2 aspects of things that are studied there. One is just the physical layout of the menu. So for example, people, I think, don't tend to order things close to the edge of the menu. So you want to, I think, put the items you like ordered kind of more in the middle of the physical menu itself. How do you advertise specials, things like that. So I think there's a little research field on that, people who look at exactly how the perceptual aspect of the menu is going to impact ordering. And I'm by no means an expert in that, but I know just the physical layout. People typically don't like ordering the first or the last thing. They don't like ordering the cheapest or the most expensive thing, right? So the cheapest glass of wine rarely gets ordered, neither is the more expensive. And so I think things you really want to sell, you might want to put more in the middle.
Yeah. And when it comes to I also find I'm curious about this because good friends of mine, they opened their own restaurants and bars. And when I saw their menus, my first question was, why do you have so much stuff on the menu? It took me 10 minutes to read the entire menu, and I didn't even make a decision yet. I still need time to process all this. Can't you just, make like some type of decision tree here?
There's a very well-known concept in decision-making research called the paradox of choice.
Right.
And from a purely economic rationality point of view, the more choice you have, the better. So, if I give you a choice of 100 entrees, the likelihood of you finding the entree that exactly fits your dietary requirements, your mood today, how full you want to be is increased, right? That's just kind of mathematically the case. That the more choices you have, the better. It turns out people do not want more choices, and people would rather have less choices than more choices in a given situation. There's plenty of experiments demonstrating this, that given the choice, people prefer, they don't want no choice, but they want less choice because it's just simply overwhelming to have pages and pages of menu items. And so that's a well-known case where, economic rationality clashes with what people actually want reality. So people don't want infinite choice, despite what marketers like to give them and supermarkets like to provide. Some reasonable number of items is usually considered preferable because it reduces the stress of choosing.
Yeah. No, that's definitely good to know. I will pass that information on. Yes. Now, I'm afraid our time has come to an end. I want to, thank you so much for your time and this conversation. If people want to reach out to you, what would be a good way of how they could do that?
Well, you can contact me via email. So I think you can probably put it in the notes.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah. a.sanfey@Donders.
Okay.
.ru.nl. Or you can look at my website, alansanfey.com. I think there's contact information there.
All right, that's great. No, I will definitely put that into the show notes so nobody has to write anything down.
I wish I had Twitter handles and Facebook.
No worries.
I stay away from that.
Well, based on what we talked about, that doesn't sound too bad. Well, thanks again, and to everyone that's listening, you have a great day.
Thank you, Ajmal.
Hey everyone, just one more thing before you go. I hope you enjoyed the show, and to stay up to date with future episodes and additional content we share, you can sign up to our blog and you'd get an email every Friday. Why Friday? Because it's almost weekend and we want to give a fun end of the week bonus that you can also talk about during your Friday afternoon drinks. It'll be a short email with our latest updates about bridging the gap between science and UX. The content we share ranges from conversations between UX and science, like we have on this podcast, our own journey from scientists turning into entrepreneurs, all the way to our own studies where we dig deeper into concepts of UX. If you want to receive that to stay in the loop, sign up at mind-trace.com/blog. mind-trace.com/blog.